Hello, learners. Welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lecture, I introduced very briefly a landmark speech and essay, which is The Minute on Indian Education, published in the year 1835 by Thomas Babington Macaulay. I discussed this essay as a way of understanding the kind of overt or manifest Orientalism which was practiced and seen in many Victorian era documents. A lot of these documents had some similar features. They often justified the lack of civilization, the lack of self consciousness, the lack of cultural or intellectual merit in the minds and work of people from non-European parts of the world. And this document by Thomas Babington Macaulay has become a landmark document and is among the most famous documents which are understood to demonstrate this kind of racialist attitude. That is why it is important for us to think and understand how exactly this document ends up producing that effect. Reading from this document and understanding how this works will also help us understand what Edward Said has talked about as Orientalism, and which I have discussed in great detail in previous lectures. Let us now read exactly what Thomas Babington Macaulay says and try and understand what was that problem to which he was responding, and how, through his claim that the British government should provide education to Indians in English, he thought he was best serving a problematic situation. He thought that this was the best possible alternative among other options. Let us try and understand that, and we will try and understand better how this is an instance of Victorian era racial dynamics. Macaulay writes, "We now come to the gist of the matter. We have a fund to be employed as government shall direct for the intellectual improvement of the people of this country. The simple question is, what is the most useful way of employing it?" So it's very clear the condescension or the power dynamic in this statement is not incidental. It is not accidental. It is very much an assumption. This document is written by an Englishman for Englishmen, and not just any Englishman. These are highly influential Englishmen. They are all men of education and property, and as a result, they wield a great deal of political power. So the assumption that both the writer and the intended audience of this document hold is that Indians are less civilized and therefore need to be educated by their English rulers. So this part is not in dispute. In fact, this part is not even a creation of the author of this document. The author of this document is not really concerned with whether or not the colonization of India is proper or good or bad. The author is concerned with something slightly different, which is, given that India is a British colony and the British government has a task, has a certain problem for which it needs to perform a task. And for solving that problem, for performing that task, it has put aside a sum of money. Now the question to be decided is, how should that money be spent so that its purpose is served, right? What is the purpose exactly? The purpose is that the British government was finding it difficult to govern India. They really lacked a group of people who were aware of the laws and were aware of the minute processes by which government worked. And in order to create or import or transport a group of people who could have those skills, it was decided to educate and provide that training to people in India. There was already an established method of getting people to do this, which was to transport people with the required skills and knowledge from England to India. That, however, had proven to be less effective and was not working very well. Therefore, the next best thing was to use the resources of the government and to provide that education to people in India. Now, given that it was decided to educate Indians, the question was, in what language should they be educated? And here, Macaulay's point is that the kind of education that the British government requires or needs to provide to Indians, that is not available in the many vernacular languages of India. Right? And so to explain that, Macaulay writes, all parties agree that the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literary nor scientific information, and are moreover so poor and rude that until they are enriched from some other quarter, it will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them. So it is not only a factual statement, but also a qualitative judgment here. It's not that certain ideas and concepts don't exist in Indian literature, but because of that difference, because of that qualitative difference, Macaulay also judges the literature of India to be inferior to that of the Western European nations. This is the beginning of a series of value judgments which will culminate in an extremely violent and racist statement towards which we are slowly building up in this series of quotations. Macaulay further writes that even though he does not have first-hand knowledge and is not an expert of either Sanskrit or Arabic, he has consulted experts and has read several translations. And from the documents and testimonies as well as published writings of these experts, the Orientalists, he has garnered that, and this has gone down as an infamous statement of Victorian racism. Macaulay writes, a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Right? This is an instance of the kind of Orientalist logic that Edward Said has described in his 1978 book, Orientalism. Without a first-hand knowledge of what exists in the Orient, authorities based in the Occident are able to form opinions about the Orient. Further, these opinions do not just remain opinions, but in fact are universalized, expanded, and given the certainty of truth. Right? So this is an instance of Orientalism, and it will successively get stronger and more problematic. On the question of what language should the education be provided to Indians, Macaulay writes, what then shall that language be? One half of the committee maintain that it should be the English. The other half strongly recommend the Arabic and Sanskrit. The whole question seems to me to be, which language is the best worth knowing? Right? So because people entrusted with making that decision have not reached a decision, that is, the jury seems to be hung, some Orientalists believe that educating Indians in English would be the best thing, whereas some Orientalists believe that Indians should be allowed to study Arabic and Sanskrit. Given that the scholarly experts are not able to arrive at a decision, this parliamentarian, this man, Macaulay, takes it upon himself to provide a solution and to make the best possible decision. And to answer that, to make that decision, here is what Macaulay writes. How then stands the case? We have to educate a people who cannot at present be educated by means of their mother tongue. We must teach them some foreign language. The claims of our own language, it is hardly necessary to recapitulate. It stands preeminent even among the languages of the West. Right? So an instance of self-supremacy, that is Pax Britannica, which is a phrase I've quoted earlier, the security and the comfort gained by military victories that England had secured over other European nations, allows this individual to claim that the cultural superiority of English is so certain and has been established so firmly that it does not require any further repetition or articulation. Now, despite saying that, Macaulay does try and describe exactly why English language and English culture is more superior. And here is what Macaulay writes. And here it refers to English literature, it abounds with works of imagination not inferior to the noblest, which Greece has bequeathed to us, with models of every species of eloquence, with historical composition, which, considered merely as narratives, have seldom been surpassed, and which, considered as vehicles of ethical and political instruction, have never been equaled with, just and lively representations of human life and human nature, with the most profound speculations on metaphysics, morals, government, jurisprudence, trade, with full and correct information respecting every experimental science which tends to preserve the health, to increase the comfort, or to expand the intellect of man. Whoever knows that language has ready access to all the vast intellectual wealth which all the wisest nations of the earth have created and hoarded in the course of 90 generations. It may safely be said that the literature now extant in that language is of greater value than all the literature which 300 years ago was extant in all the languages of the world together. Nor is this all. In India, English is the language spoken by the ruling class. It is spoken by the higher class of natives at the seats of government. So here Macaulay makes a shift from describing the qualitative superiority of English language and culture over other languages and cultures to describing how the English language exists at a place of cultural superiority among the natives of India as well. This is an additional benefit because it's a language which is not alien. It is a language which already plays a particular role in Indian society. Now, this is a role that is given to it because of the widespread importance and superiority of the English as a race and as a political class. And this role would automatically benefit the current task which the British government has before itself. That task is to create a more efficient class of Indians who will also be good at serving in the British government. Okay? Because English is already occupying a place of superiority in relation to other languages, Macaulay speculates that in the future, that superiority will rise and it would be most pragmatic for the British government to make use of this opportunity. This is a good opportunity. English is likely to become the language of commerce throughout the seas of the East. Here's Macaulay again. It is the language of two great European communities which are rising. The one in the south of Africa, the other in Australia. Communities which are every year becoming more important and more closely connected with our Indian empire. Whether we look at the intrinsic value of our literature or at the particular situation of this country, we shall see the strongest reason to think that of all foreign tongues, the English tongue is that which would be the most useful to our native subjects. Now, this statement about choosing a language which would be of most use to our native subjects, this appears to be a kind or a benevolent or a helpful gesture. However, that kindness or that benevolence is highly suspect given that the larger frame of this statement is one of extraction and governmentality. So the kind of use to which the English can be put by the native subjects of colonial India is a very limited one. The kind of use that Macaulay imagines Indians will put English to can be understood by the context of a British colonial rule. That is, English will be beneficial to Indians given that for the foreseeable future, India is likely to be a British colony. So the assumption that the British colonization of India will continue to remain in place for an indefinite future is what allows this statement of benevolence to be articulated in the first place. Now, further, whether or not the British government should impart education in English is determined by the qualities of the Indian languages and literatures which are already available to these natives. And here, the distinction that Macaulay makes is one of scientific accuracy, right? Indian languages and literatures encourage a non scientific outlook upon the world, whereas the English language and the literatures and scholarly writings available in the English language, these, on the other hand, encourage a rational, scientific, and more pragmatic outlook on the world. This is the distinction that Macaulay makes. And as we discussed in our previous discussion of Orientalism, this is textbook Orientalism. This is a perfect example of the kind of ideological work that Edward Said has described in his book Orientalism. Without really understanding the writings that are available in Indian literature, Macaulay is able to make that claim that if someone reads in Indian literature, they will have a fantastical, non-realistic, non-scientific, or superstitious view of the world. And here is how Macaulay describes it. Some instances of the kind of literature or the kind of fantastical imagination that Indian literature encourages are described thus: medical doctrines which would disgrace an English farrier, astronomy which would move laughter in girls at an English boarding school, history abounding with kings 30 feet high in reigns 30,000 years long, and geography made of seas of treacle and seas of butter. So these are clearly moments taken out of context, moments from Indian mythology, from Indian literature, which are very obviously fantastical and fictional stories. They are not meant to be taken as scientific facts. However, Macaulay takes the liberty to quote these moments outside of their textual contexts and makes the judgment that Indian literature, if studied, will encourage a highly non-scientific view. Macaulay goes on in this fashion, and I'll just read one last quote before moving on. Macaulay writes, "In one point, I fully agree with the gentlemen to whose general views I am opposed. I feel with them that it is impossible for us, with our limited means, to attempt to educate the body of the people. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population." Now, this passage, again, is among the most frequently cited words by Macaulay. And manner in which these words are read and cited is to find in Macaulay a highly notorious instance of Victorian racism. What exactly is that racism? Let us try and understand briefly. So, the most obvious instance of racism can be seen in that phrase that Macaulay identifies the task of the British government as that of forming a class who may be interpreters between the government, that is the white British government, and the millions whom we govern, that is the majority of Indians. This class is described in a peculiar way by Macaulay. This is a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This description of a class of persons, or in a way, this is the ideal product This is the kind of human being that Macaulay's plan of education is trying to create. The description of this kind of human being in two ways has provoked a lot of anger and frustration from a lot of scholars. And rightly so. One can imagine why someone reading this would feel infuriated. This is a class of Indians that has two features. In taste and in blood, they are different. In their physical appearance and in their physical existence, they are Indians. But in their intellectual lives, in the way they think, in the way they form opinions, think, etc., they are English. It is this dual existence. It describes a sort of alienation. It describes an almost reduced state of existence, a highly mechanical form of functioning. In a way, this describes the reduction and the dehumanization of Indians who can only thrive under British occupation by becoming this sort of a robotic, alienated figure, unrecognizable to themselves, living a split identity, and always shuttling between these two identities. Describes what is a highly reduced form of existence, but praises this reduced existence as if something attractive, something worth striving for. Now, not only is this alienated existence described as something attractive, it is also ascribed certain educational responsibilities. This alienated Indian, this Indian who feels and looks Indian but thinks in an English way, this Indian is given the task of educating the entirety of India. And here is how Macaulay describes it. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country. So this is actually a very smart move, according to Macaulay. It is smart because a few people can be given the task to educate India. Instead of educating India, what the British government can do is that they can educate a very tiny percentage, maybe 1% of India, and they can outsource that very difficult task. They can outsource that task of educating the nation to this tiny class of highly educated Indians. Right? Now, this is also seen as very problematic by many scholars, that the British government assumed that the political power of the English language and culture and the kind of economic power that English would have. People would need to learn English in order to gain material benefits like jobs or money or other kinds of financial and material well-being. That assumption of the superiority of English is manipulated by Macaulay and used by Macaulay to create an outsourced model of education. There is also a future-facing outlook in this statement, that once the British government introduces English education for a minuscule portion of Indians, they can inaugurate a process by which future generations of Indians will become more and more English. And so this is the meaning of that phrase, render them by degrees fit vehicles. So the Indian languages will also be anglicized. This is a very powerful thing to say and to imagine and to be certain that it will happen in the future. Macaulay thinks that not only will the British government gain able class of government employees, but they will also set up a process by which a few generations from their time, Indian languages and cultures will slowly become anglicized, so that the society itself will start changing. It is not just that the British government will achieve its goal of efficient governance, but Indian society itself will slowly transform into a different, more anglicized, less Indian version of itself. Right? So here I think we can pause and appreciate the full extent of how Orientalism impacted the world and how Orientalism is responsible for shaping the world that we see around us. Now, I'll briefly refer to one scholarly work which is titled Masks of Conquest by the scholar Gauri Vishwanathan, who argues that this kind of a document, and Vishwanathan's work is among the most serious and authoritative scholarly accounts of Macaulay's Minutes, the document on which I have spent the majority of this lecture. Vishwanathan argues that this document represents a mask of conquest, that while on the surface, a statement like Macaulay's appeared to be a benevolent or kind gesture, that he was simply trying to provide the most efficient means of educating vast swathe of Indians. This might be what it was claimed to be or appeared to be, but in fact, it was a mask of conquest. It was a strategy to conquer, that is, to suppress and exploit and extract the resources from India. Now, this is certainly one of the most influential ways that scholars have studied this push for Indian education in India. It's important to note, however, that there were other ways of studying the impact and the influence of this policy, which is to impart education in the English language to Indians in colonial India. We will turn to the work of a poet named Toru Dutt in the next lecture, who is among the earliest and most influential beneficiaries of this policy. So the policy which was decided by Macaulay in this speech, and which is very clearly a notorious instance of British imperial expansion, also led to some interesting and unpredictable effects in the literary field. We will discuss what effects this British education policy had and how the literary field shaped up in ways that were different from the society of Victorian era India in the next lecture. Thank you.